and let me make sure if I get this right. This new law would make it illegal to write about what's already in the public domain, which is already on the internet, which is still on servers that the authorities cannot shut down. So they want to shut it down in a different way by saying that we cannot write about what WikiLeaks has already reported. We're running in Consortium News a series of articles. We're digging into the materials that are out there to put out to the public what WikiLeaks has done, the work that they've done, what they've accomplished, to shift the focus from Julian's personality, which of course the mainstream media is trying to do, to smear him. That would be illegal then under this new law then. To write about what WikiLeaks has already published, is that what you're actually saying? Was that what Annie was saying?
If they do expand the regulations, and would it be everything from the present moment into the future, or would this be retroactive? Now, that's also a fair question to ask. Is it going to be, would they be so brazen as to make it a retroactive? Everything's on the table based on what we've all seen unfold in the last few months and years. So nothing would surprise me. The other point at some point, the crime of leaking, if it falls foul of the Espionage Act or the Whistleblowers Action in the United States, or falls foul of the Official Secrets Act, or the data was stolen, or the documents were stolen, at some point, what is revealed in the leak it trumps by orders of magnitude the crime committed in actually leaking it. And certainly with WikiLeaks, we're talking about war crimes that the people who have perpetrated the war crimes haven't faced justice for what they've done. Instead, the only person facing justice, or people facing justice, are those who've exposed the war crime. So in terms of the scales of justice here, looking at this situation, it's very out of balance. And is the crime of stealing a document, is that greater than the injustices and criminal activity that's been exposed in the leak itself?
Indeed, she was obligated, Chelsea was, as all service members are, by the Nuremberg codes, to reveal crimes that are being committed. That's an obligation. Yeah. And number two, that Obama administration executive order, which said no material can be classified if it's embarrassing or revealed or covers up corruption or criminality. So that was, in a sense, should not have been classified. A lot of the stuff that WikiLeaks has published over the years from the U.S. after this executive order should not have been classified. But again, there was an obligation on her part to reveal this crime. What's interesting about her trial that I just found out is that they did allow her to make a statement about her motives in trying to let the public know that these crimes were committed. That normally will not happen in a civil trial. That was a court-martial where there's no jury, but there is a jury in a civil trial, and they don't want the jury to hear what the motives are. Like Ellsberg has pointed out, he was not allowed to explain on the stand why he did what he did, why he leaked the Pentagon papers, why he thought the war in Vietnam it was immoral and needed to be stopped, and that the government was lying about the fact that they were losing the war. He couldn't say that because the jury could turn around and say, well, yeah, he broke the law, but we're going to exonerate him anyway, and that's what's called jury nullification. So she was able to say that in that trial and give the reasons why she put that information out. So I don't know if they could prosecute you for ignoring a D notice, correct?
Yeah, it's a fine line, a gray area, a sort of unwritten code, as it were. It's officially unofficially a voluntary censorship kind of cooperation arrangement between the mainstream press and the government. So yeah, I don't think by the letter they could prosecute. But they could do, who knows, because also according to Annie Michon last night, she said the intelligence agencies are not accountable to anybody, despite all of the assurances constantly, oh yes, we absolutely do things ethically, and we're regulated under kind of civil service. And no, it's, according to Annie, it doesn't exist. That's just a myth. So if you think about that in a kind of U.S. context and the comments made by Senator Chuck Schumer, not so long ago, that if you cross the intelligence agencies the wrong way, they have 6 ways till Sunday to get even with you. Think about that statement.
One of those 6 ways is to get the Department of Justice to indict you, which they've now done against Julian Assange. So, and he's been thrown in Belmarsh prison. That's one of the 6 ways. Another of them are ones that he expressed in that 60 Minutes interview that he feared for him and his staff, and that would be assassination. He openly spoke about that. That's one of the 6 ways. As far as oversight goes, it was the Church Committee hearings in the mid-1970s that revealed since the end of the Second World War, the enormous crimes that were committed by U.S. intelligence agencies, the NSA, the FBI, and the CIA principally. And out of those hearings, which we cannot imagine ever taking place today, but one of the things that came out of the Church Committee was that the Senate and House Intelligence Committees was set up. They were supposed to be the oversight. And that's also a joke from it is manipulated by the intelligence agencies. The best example probably is that when the torture report was to be issued by the CIA, they didn't want that issued, and they were spying on the Senate Intelligence Committee.
That's right.
They were spying on their overseers.
According to Dianne Feinstein at the time, if he remembers, he said on record that the CIA had spent upwards of, I'm quoting her, I believe from memory, but $40 million to suppress that report, because I think she was running point on compiling that. So I mean, that's a big statement by a senior ranking U.S. senator, and that just kind of went by the wayside. I watched that unfold on CNN at the time. I think that was in 2015 or something like that. And it just washed down the river of, and that's so significant. That should have been opened up and examined by all of these outlets. I mean, that's a very hugely underreported story, and her statement, which she made live on the air on CNN, it just got completely, washed down the river of the memory hole.
And by the way, the Wall Street Journal and other newspapers, you'd have to hope that somebody in the British establishment, in the judiciary, gets it. But I'm not very optimistic. How do you feel about that? Because we had a debate here last week between 2 of our guests about whether, and 4 of us actually ganged up on one of them. He was Alistair Thompson, the guy who founded Scoop NZ, was convinced that there's no way the British courts will extradite Assange. They just can't, because of the reasons we're discussing here. This is a fundamental press freedom issue. Britain has too much to lose, too much embarrassment. If they're seen around the world as acquiescing to their master in Washington to give up an Australian citizen to the U.S. for publishing. And how do you feel about that? What's your level of pessimism or optimism about what is going to happen in this?
Alexander Mercurius, who's an editor of the Duran .com website, who's also an extremely experienced and trained legal professional. He said that he still holds out confidence. He said this last night, that of all the branches of government in Britain, the judiciary is perhaps the most apolitical, and possibly the least corrupted by politics. But this is another reason why Britain was MPs, 70-something MPs signed a letter. I don't know if you saw this, to encouraging Sweden to reopen the sex case against Julian Assange, and said that in doing so, they have to, to protect future victims of sexual assault and women all over the world who are potential victims. They really hammed it up, and they drafted this letter. And so this just came out right after he was bundled out of the Ecuadorian embassy. So what I saw there, and it was led by the Blairites, a lot of Blairite members of the Labour Party, including Jess Phillips. I saw that as a political opportunity to sort of encourage Sweden to revive this completely dead-end sex misconduct or assault case. And that kind of offshores the problem for Britain of the extradition issue. And so that's a really desperate political move by those MPs. I can't believe that, and kind of virtue signaling with the, Me Too juggernaut as well, kind of using this as really the worst levels of politicizing something. For government to do that is just unbelievable. But they've tried it on, and I don't think Sweden's going to bite on that one. But so they just want Sweden to, shoulder the burden of being blamed for passing off Assange to the United States, rather than Britain, who's meant to be a paragon of democratic values, international values, and press freedoms and all sorts of free speech. They're not going to have to take responsibility. 21st Century Wire and our features writer Nina Cross, we had a conversation with Alfred de Zayas, who is a former UN rapporteur for Venezuela and Ecuador, and he said that this is what's happened is in violation of Article 2 of the Lisbon Treaty, which says that people are protected from politicized justice, but also that journalists can't be, prosecuted for doing their job as journalists. And this also violates Article 19 of the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights.
The idea that Assange hacked and is not a journalist is key to these weasels weaseling their way out of this. I'm talking about the judges in the UK, the authorities in the US, and the media, the established media, by saying he was a hacker. Like that New York Times editorial the day after his arrest was just abominable. It was appalling because it said, we don't do that. We don't hack the information. Now, of course, the word hack, as Glenn Greenwald was the first to point out, hack does not exist. It does not appear in the indictment. It was in the press release from the Department of Justice. In the headline, that is no mistake. They know people don't read full articles. They don't read full press releases. They maybe read the first paragraph. They look at the headline. So they put the word hack in there. He's a hacker, not a journalist. He's a hacker. And in fact, as Jen Robbins pointed out, he was just trying to help a source that already had legal access to this material to hide her identity, which every investigative journalist must do. And Robert Perry, the founder of Consortium News, wrote in a piece in December 2010, when it became known that the Obama administration was investigating Assange, that he often encouraged his sources to break the law to prevent the committing of a larger law. It is a law, it is a violation when you've signed this non-disclosure agreements to give this material to the press. It does violate the Espionage Act, the letter of the Espionage Act. But if in breaking that small law, you are trying to prevent the larger war of continued war crimes in Iraq, or in Ellsberg's case, the continuation of this disastrous war in Southeast Asia, that was something that's what whistleblowers do. That's the risk that they take. They know they're breaking a law, but they're doing it because they want to stop a much larger crime that's being committed. And the publisher is innocent in this, should be anyway. You said about the Constitution, whether an American judge, but this has not been challenged, this section of the Espionage Act, on a First Amendment grounds. Is that a constitutional part of that law, that the government can arrest and prosecute a publisher or journalist for possessing and disseminating classified information without being authorized to do so? That has never been challenged because no one's ever been prosecuted under it. That he would be the first. And you would have to think that would be a constitutional challenge. But this awful Supreme Court that we've got now, was made even more awful by Trump. You can't have too much optimism that they would come down and say, yes, strike that out of the Espionage Act, because that is clearly unconstitutional. It's a law that, while it's a law that chills free speech, and it's Congress that enacted it, and that's the actual language of the First Amendment. Congress shall not enact any law abridging freedom of speech or the press, and that Section E does do that in effect, absolutely, even if it's not a prior restraint issue, and that has to be challenged. If it were challenged successfully, Assange is a free man if they have indicted him under that Section E, which is what everyone thinks is going to happen.
One would hope, from a Supreme Court justice point of view, that they would be able to look at that and say, is that activity, certainly in the case of Daniel Ellsberg and others, is that in the public interest? And so by enforcing Section 8, is that in the public interest, or is that in the government's interest? Is that in Okay, there are two different things, and I think we're meant to believe that the national security state's interests are synonymous and equivalent with the public interest. But this is what a high court judge or a Supreme Court judge is appointed to make such determinations that are that fundamental. And it really comes down to a moral imperative, an ethical imperative, and that's the basis of the U.S. Constitution, one would hope, anyway. And this is why they're appointed for life, to make such important fundamental determinations about the nature of the U.S. Constitution. And so that to me is a legitimate up for grabs point. The public interest versus the government's interest, or the national security state's interest. Because if it's going to save lives, in the case of Daniel Ellsberg, the Vietnam War, curtailing that war by a year potentially is going to save who knows how many tens of thousands of lives. In terms of Chelsea Manning, that leak could have saved by drawing down U.S. troops in Afghanistan and in Iraq, would save U.S. Servicemen's lives and save Iraqi lives, many more Iraqi lives, of course. So that's the argument. Even if it's in a public interest and it can save lives, is this not worth exposing? Is this level of accountability not worth it? For society, it's that fundamental. And I think I would like to see high court judges looking at these issues in that with that lens.
So let's wrap up. What happened today in London in the magistrate's court is Assange appeared via video link from Belmarsh prison. He made a very strong statement that he refuses to surrender. He will not surrender to the United States for the act of journalism that won multiple awards and that protected lives. So just to recap again, it was a 10-minute hearing. And then there's going to be another hearing on May 30th, the procedural one. There's a more substantive one on June 12th. That's the deadline for the U.S. to add any more charges, because the U.K. could only, under the treaty with the United States, extradition treaty, can only extradite someone to another country based on the charges at that time, and no new charges can be added. However, there is this rule of specialty that is in that treaty, and that the U.S. could ask Britain to waive it, and that means they could get him extradited on this 5-year maximum charge for intruding in a government computer, and then add stuff once he gets on U.S. soil. That's still a possibility.
Yeah, I think just to add to what you've just said there, Joe, that's why I think the fast tracking of the bail hearing on May 1st is kind of significant, in the sense that that's the British government there putting their thumb holding down Julian Assange for pretty much 1 year. So it's a placeholder, and that and you could view that as that gives the United States a year to sort of get their ducks in a row in terms of extraditing Julian Assange, because there was no crime committed in Sweden. He wasn't charged with anything. He was wanted for questioning, in which he complied with the first prosecutor in that case, left the country with the full knowledge of the Swedish government to the UK. Then the second prosecutor picked up the sexual complaint case in Sweden, and then they basically sandbagged questioning him. They could have done so remotely. They had ample opportunity. And in fact, through a FOIA request, which many people are aware of, that the CPS in the UK was in fact sandbagging it, and also telling the Swedes, don't stay the course on this. You're not going to, collapse on this one. You got to stay on side with us, basically. And so that whole delay, and the CPS in the UK not telling the Swedes not to, come question him in the Ecuadorian embassy. That's the proof that this was just a vehicle. The Swedish case was just a vehicle for extradition. That was laid out very well by Nina Cross in her article on 21st Century Wire, which is right now at the top of the feature section. But the fundamental point, which I'm going to end with, which is the important point in terms of the press freedom, which you started to articulate, Joe, was we have a state. If the press is not willing to be that watchdog, and it's been co-opted or corrupted, corporatized, what have you, then what? Then the state believes that it alone can monitor and regulate its activities. So the state clearly doesn't want a functioning fourth estate in this case. So what's that called historically? What type of government form is that? It's not the government that we see ourselves as a democracy. It's more like a fascist government. And that's been proven throughout history. This is how those types of governments behave. And so we have to ask ourselves, is this what we want as a society? It's simple as that.